TDPK Podcasts, Thailand GameChanger, inside the minds of Thailand's innovators. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Thailand GameChanger. I love that intro, by the way. Today, we are joined by Dennis Keller, the Chief Business Officer at Siam Seaplane. Dennis, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's great to have you here. How are you doing?
Thank you for welcoming me. I'm all right. It's okay. How about yourself?
I am doing super. We can share about that later. Why don't we get a little bit of your background just to get us started?
Sure. So where to start? Maybe first of all, I've been in Thailand now for, I think, almost 7 years.
Wow.
It still feels like just about a year, but somehow time always
Seems to
moves
pass nicely.
faster, right? So it's been a while, but background is basically I started off my sort of career in banking and consulting, so a very kind of business commercial background.
Yeah.
Always with a strong interest in technology, actually. So how can we use kind of tech as an enabler, right? So not just as a solution in itself, but as an enabler to build kind of better opportunities, better services, more interesting things out there. And that led me actually to the tech world. I was in telco for quite a few years, worked all over the world, a lot in Africa, eventually then moved here over to Thailand, fairly randomly, let's say. It wasn't particularly that I had an eye on Thailand as such, but the opportunity was right and personal reasons. But so moved here, and then also eventually had more and more of a shift. And so that shift, I think, on the one hand was moving from corporate a lot more into the startup world, partly because I did my own startups. I was involved a lot in consulting startups and investing in startups. Then finally doing my own and having a little exit there, which was a great experience to kind of go full circle from all the way, really just the idea to taking it through, making it a business, and then merging it with a local company, right. Basically in Indonesia. Was in FinTech for a little bit, and then came, as it often goes, over drinks. This is how a lot of the good things happen, with this idea presented to me of, why aren't there any seaplanes in Thailand? And now, to give you a very quick idea about this connection here as well, is I did my private pilot license a number of years ago. And so really had as a hobby, as a passion to fly. I'd done some paragliding before, and it was always exciting for me to be kind of in the air, not just traveling, from place to place, but
right.
Flying myself. And so I'd done the pilot license. And of course, as you may imagine, the kind of pilot community, especially private pilot community in Thailand, is not a massive one. It's a very small community. And it was kind of through that, that these drinks eventually happened and that idea was presented to me. And it was a very opportune time. And I said, you know what? That's a great question. Let me look at it from my angle, not from the aviation world, right? Not from being
right.
a commercial pilot or, in aviation and airline management or anything like that. But kind of, I've always looked at business cases and numbers and kind of go-to-market propositions and how to grow that, these
right.
kind of questions. And so I said, yeah, let's look at it. Let's look at what are the challenges and the interesting things. And one thing leads to another. Now here I am as a chief business officer of what is a possibly, I would say, revolutionary, change in transportation for Thailand.
That sounds awesome. I want to get to the revolution in a second, but before we do that, I want to ask you something about a long time ago. Mm-hmm. First of all, what is the Asian Rural Institute, and what did you do there? And I'm curious, because here's the thing. If I go back and look at your history, it looks like you've seamlessly moved between sort of social innovation and impact investing in traditional business and startups throughout your career, right? In other words, you did, like you said, you worked at the Asian Rural Institute, but you also worked at Telenor. And these things are completely different, but I think there is experiences you can get from both that lead you into being like a successful entrepreneur. And I'm curious what you learned at ARI, or whatever you want to call it, that you've taken and like worked forward with for the rest of your life.
So that's a really interesting question. I haven't had that question, I think, in a long time. ARI, or Asian Rural Institute, is an organization in Japan that actually trains people from the developing world. If let's just use that term. There may be some political sensitivities around it, but anyway, basically from the developing world, training people in a number of issues around kind of sustainability. It has a lot to do with agriculture. It has a lot to do with things like microfinance, but overall sustainability. And I was working there doing a lot around coordination with the different kind of NGOs and organizations around the world that would send these people to Japan for that kind of 9 months training.
Got it.
Now, seemingly in the surface, it's very different from, you mentioned Telenor as a, globally leading mobile operator, right? Mobile phone operator, or things like working for a bank, or in the tech startup world. But to me, actually, it has all a very close connection. And so what I quickly encountered at the Asian Rural Institute was the question for me of how do we find possibly solutions or answers to the big fundamental and systemic questions of how do we improve opportunities? How do we improve access to opportunities? How do we essentially sort of this silly question of how do we make the world a better place?
Right.
Which led me, I think, a bit on this journey of thinking about what are the right methods and ways that we can tackle that. And development aid is one of them. And I found, and this is maybe a bit of a stretch for some, but I found in many ways that, for instance, technology and mobile tech in particular is a huge enabler when it comes to finding solutions to a lot of these things. And I think maybe some of the listeners and you will know that, take, for instance, mobile money, which became hugely popular in Africa in particular, but equally in some markets here in Asia. Mobile financial services, mobile banking, that all of a sudden enabled this, I think, vast amount of population that didn't have access to the regular financial services, that didn't have access to bank accounts, to now participate much better in society, to start maybe doing micro savings, to start, enjoying kind of services and things that they couldn't. And so to me, that was a bit that gateway that led me into this world of thinking about how can we address some of these challenges and issues. And so always, I think it's guided me and led me throughout my entire career and all of my choices in terms of whether I invest in a startup or work on even something like Siam Seaplane now, to say, how can we use that, not necessarily 100%, but use it alongside building something that improves the sort of status quo, improves, for instance, now accessibility, or improves the environmental impact, or, previously it was perhaps about the financial services, right? So there's always these kind of angles to it for me.
Yeah. So I wanted to introduce the idea that what seems to be completely unrelated actually takes a very similar mindset of, there's a set of problems that nobody seems to have been able to solve yet. I'm interested in solving those problems at scale. I can use technology to enable the solution to some of those problems, not all of them. And again, with the ability to use technology to scale. And I can have a mindset of problem solving as opposed to just forgetting that problem exists and moving on. And I can make the equivalency that also having limited resources forces me to be very creative and innovative in a way that I might not have been if I'd had excess resources. And to just make the connection from that to a startup, which, if you didn't know what I was talking about before I started talking, would sound like exactly the same thing. Is that fair?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
So that's why I wanted to talk about that. Sorry, go ahead.
No, just to add a little to that, I think if I look back at kind of my background and also what I studied at, when I did my undergraduate and then actually my graduate degree as well, I've always come, and perhaps even further back when I look at kind of, high school and such, but it's always been for me an angle to it from, we need to look at things from different perspectives, right? So my undergraduate was a liberal arts degree, right? It wasn't in the US, but it's very common in the US, right? Where you have as liberal arts kind of a whole host of subjects, and initially you don't almost know what you're studying, but it kind of all makes more and more sense as you progress and as you maybe, choose particular models that come together. And so I think it provides this fantastic opportunity to say, we have one problem, but just because it's one problem doesn't mean it's just we have to look at it in one direction. We can look at it from different angles, and being able to look at it from different angles means we can actually find better and different solutions for it. And I think that same applies in a way to this kind of story. And when we're looking at things that, maybe at the surface seem completely unrelated, well, they're not. It just depends how you look at it and what you take out from it and what you make with it.
Exactly. Where are you from originally, by the way?
As you can hear from my accent, no, I'm German originally.
It doesn't sound German at all. That's why I asked. Otherwise, I would just presume. Okay, that's great. What do you think about entrepreneurship? What about entrepreneurship that keeps drawing you back to it? Do you know what I mean? In other words, you have worked for big companies, you have worked for other people, but you always seem to be kind of tiptoeing around. Actually, I'm going to start a company to do this. I'm going to build a company to solve this problem. What is it about entrepreneurship that's so compelling for you?
I think a couple of things. One would definitely be the how to say, like, the actionability. I mean, like, you get shit done, right? And I think that always is what makes a difference between a corporate and a startup. Whether it's being part of a startup or doing your own startup. But even there, that difference of being part of a startup and then really doing your own, there is a massive difference that I think
there is.
You really realize when you're in the middle of it and when you're doing it, just how much of a difference there is when you are building it. And I mean, really being able to direct where things should go. And I think it's part of that. So this making the action, having that immediate view on execution, I think is what always drew me back and what always draws me back to just starting my own things or being part of, starting things. And the other thing I would say, and I think it's very closely related, is perhaps about this impact, right? And the impact that we can make, which that's not to say that you can't have that in a corporate. And I mean, there's fantastic examples of very many corporates out there that have tremendous impact on the economy and on improvement of life and so many other things and services and everything. But I think as an individual, to feel that impact in a corporate, it may take a much longer time, right? In a way that, you're always just a little cog in the wheel. And so maybe it until you're a kind of big executive, you don't really feel like you're contributing to this impact.
Right.
And again, that in a startup is you're right there. I mean, if I look at my work now, for instance, where I deal with, and personally with anyone from, the leading resort general managers to hotel and island owners to our various ministers in the government on national level. And then on top of that comes, to a certain extent, an international exposure. It's just something unthinkable if you were part of a corporate, regardless at what level you are.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I remember building a business inside of Goldman Sachs, like you said, inside of a corporation. For most of the time that I was there, it felt like I wasn't having any impact at all. But there was a specific thing that we did I was based in Japan, but there was a specific thing that we did of building a business outside of Japan and the rest of Asia. And we kind of did it from scratch. Now, I cannot make an equivalency to really starting from scratch because we were not resource constrained at any level. As a matter of fact, there were plenty of resources to do it. But it took a certain amount of organization and focus to get that thing done, right? Because there was little structure. And operating in that environment actually is fun. So if you ask me why I like doing it, it's like that idea of creating something out of nothing, or at least giving it your best shot. It's just so much fun to do. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. Like the fun component, as much as it's, crazy hard work, right? And that's the other reality that, I mean, you read about it and you sort of think, sure, entrepreneurs work hard, but it is a 24/7 job. Or actually, no, it's not, right? It's not a job. It's a 24/7 engagement.
Yeah, it's 24/7
And
life. It's not a job. It's just life. Yeah.
it's life, right? However, the key difference is because it's your own thing, at least as a
Right.
real entrepreneur, it is just a completely different outlook on what that means, and the kind of reward that I get from it, and I know that my co-founders get from it in this particular case, and in other cases. So and of course we can then build the culture, and so I think that all feeds into this, ensuring that you don't want to wake up in the morning thinking, why do I need to go to work today?
Right.
You want to build
Yeah.
something where you're enjoying it. That's
Happy
how
to
it
do
should
it
be.
yeah, exactly. Happy to do it every single day. I love when people ask me, what are you doing this weekend? Like, it makes a difference.
Mm, mm,
I have no idea that it is a weekend. So talk to
right.
me about right. I mean, talk to me about the founding and the building of Siam Seaplane. I won't disagree with you that I think a lot of great ideas come when people are relaxed, sitting
Mm,
around, thinking about problems to solve. And if that happens to happen over a drink, so be it. But I do think, as you joked about it, I do think that that's true. People are sitting around going, "What are you thinking? What are you doing? Hey, wait a second. Isn't there an idea there?" And that's actually, before we get into Siam Seaplane, I want to ask you this too. Excuse me. When you look around, I think entrepreneurs are really great at identifying gaps in a market, right? And are always asking the question, like, why isn't that thing, whatever that thing is, why isn't that thing there? And why doesn't somebody do that? And a real entrepreneur goes, well, I'll do it. How do you
mm,
determine, just in general, how do you determine when you see a market gap if it deserves to have a business fill that gap, or if
mm.
it's just a smaller thing that doesn't really need a business to fill it? You know what I mean?
Right. Part of that to me is ensuring, and I learned that I think the hard way a couple of times as well, that not to jump into it. And I think with that, what that means is to ensure we really understand it first, right? And
Right.
so that means, I mean, it could be, you could talk about market validation, or you could talk about even initial surveys, understanding sort of the potential customers or the market, or whoever it might be around it. In the case of Siam Seaplane, to give you a quick teaser here, it was primarily around understanding the regulatory landscape and framework and the
Right.
challenges around that to make us decide, can we build a business around this, and can this business then really be a business and not just, like you said, kind of, okay, this might be a nice little hobby or a passion project that someone spends a few dollars on, and that's it.
Right.
So a
Right.
lot of this comes down for me to validation. And as you rightly said, the key difference for the entrepreneur and the reality of that is that difference in thinking about the idea and talking about the idea, and then saying, okay, here's how we're going to execute on that.
Right.
Right. And that's what I loved. I mean, talking about when I met with the original guy that sort of came to me with the idea, is one of our three co-founders on this one, who had a very similar approach of almost not talking at all and just saying, we execute, we just get shit done, as
Right.
simple as that, right? And so with that attitude, it works, and it works really well. So it's that combination, right, of making sure there's people around you that can execute. And I think it always takes time to figure out, especially meeting new people, and hiring new people into a very early stage of a startup as well. Will To what extent is it a talk, and to what extent is there the walk, the execution, as part
Right.
of it. So it's a lot about that for me. Yeah.
Okay. So now talk to me about Siam Seaplane. Tell me why we founded this business, and tell me about the challenges of building like a uniquely travel or mobile or mobility business inside of a pandemic.
There's so many. Where to start? And
I got
I think
time.
that's why we started it, right? Because we looked at this and we said, first of all, logistics. You look at some of the beautiful island getaways, and I can name many in Thailand that are very difficult to get to. I mean, take
Yeah.
take Kokut in the east, right, in the Trat province, where you need to fly, you need to drive, you need a boat, you need to drive again. Take Koh Tao as an example, north of Samui. Sorry?
Koh Phangan? I always mispronounce this, but yeah, another island near Samui.
Koh Phangan, Koh Tao. So yeah, plenty of examples, right, where it's just very, very difficult. So that was challenge number one, where we said, okay, actually challenge, that's an opportunity to us. Really what we see here is we can change that very immediately by offering, so what are we talking about? Siam Seaplane, it's offering a amphibious transportation option, which means we can take off on land and land on the water, or vice versa, right? Or either option. And so it cuts down significantly on the time. Now, the big challenges here were, number one, regulatory. So it wasn't entirely clear how will this be handled, because typically if you build an airport or a landing strip on land, you need the approval of the landowner. Now, the problem we have here is we're dealing with water, we're not dealing with land. And the water is not owned by any private individual or company or entity.
Right.
It is government owned. So how do we get the approval of the owner of the water to say, yes, I want a landing strip here? And so then we realized also that there had been some previous operators, about the last one about 12 years ago, which was running a service in Phuket. But since then, many things have changed. Things have changed in terms of the legal setup of the aviation authority, and sort of a whole variety of things, as well as perhaps the setup at the time was not necessarily very opportune for us. So I think there were some concerns previously with regards to how some of the operations were executed, and that's not for me to comment on in terms of what and how and good or bad, but rather we realized as we started talking about some of the regulators that we don't necessarily start from scratch, but there is some work to be done to get to kind of zero first. There is some convincing to do about, look, seaplanes are actually a very safe method of transportation. That, for example, one very quick example here is some concerns around environmental impact, negative environmental impact.
Okay.
And so then we look at it and we say, you know what, as an example, noise pollution. The noise of the seaplane is actually less than a typical jet ski. So is there really a question of noise pollution? No. The second example, the propeller of the seaplane is, of course, over the water, not under the water like a boat. So when it comes to concerns about possibly damaging underwater species,
coral, stuff like that,
fish or corals or dolphins or what have you, that concern is not warranted because there is no propeller, unlike actually most boats, in fact any boat. And in fact, the floats of the seaplane only immerse in the water for about 60 centimeters, so very, very minor immersion underwater, right? So we have all this factual, basis. We have the research studies that, partly we worked on, partly we have access to from partners and, global studies. And so there's a lot of work initially to just show that, look, this is done well and at a high standard and correctly in many other places in the world.
Right.
That alone should be a convincing factor to say we should consider it. Then the second challenge was, it's not straightforward. There's no one clear regulation in the law that says, here's how we deal with seaplanes.
Right.
And that, of course, meant that everybody says it's sort of our territory, but it isn't quite our territory. So meaning we don't only deal with and closely collaborate with the Civil Aviation Authority of Thailand under the Ministry of Transportation, we also deal with, let's say, anywhere from 5 to 10 other authorities. So the Marine Department, the Environmental Agency, the possibly National Park, depending on the region that we're looking at, the local authorities, and on and on. And at the end of the day, of course, and we knew this, we need to be the ones that need to coordinate that. We need to bring together the different stakeholders and go through and make sure that it kind of comes together at the end of the day. And so that alone, I think, kept many others that were interested in this topic of bringing seaplanes to Thailand to not do it, simply because of the complexity. And, we started this company pretty much now 2 years ago. It's been 2 years of development where, again, from day one, we knew if we start this will take time. This is complex, but we're prepared for that. We know that's what it takes. So we're not thinking, okay, in 3 months we've got the planes flying and we can service any water surface area in the country. That's not the case.
Right.
And then came COVID.
And then came COVID, exactly. But the resort owners and the sort of other businesses on the island must love the direct access ability of a seaplane. No?
They absolutely do. And that was our approach, even from the almost very beginning, to say, as we're looking at this business, we need to do it in a kind of partnership approach, not go it alone, but rather really work together here. And so our primary partners are those waterfront resorts, in many cases, the leading brands, across many locations now in Thailand,
right,
where we've been working on setting up these partnerships so that, once we launch, that we have access to all these beautiful locations, to all these beautiful resorts, and that's there, right? And so it's not a sort of guessing game of, okay, where do we want to fly to, and could this be an interesting location or not? But working very closely with a lot of these brands. And so yes, in the vast majority of cases, the general managers of the resorts, the owners of the resorts, are extremely keen on the service, because not only it's not only about accessibility, but in fact, we look at this business not so much from a transportation perspective, but a lot from the kind of lifestyle and the experience part of it, right? Because it's so unique, it's so special. In some way, we're also saying, we're making this like what is it? One of the kind of slogans there, like getting to your destination should be as memorable as being there.
Right.
Right.
So can I share a story with you?
Sure.
So when I flew on a seaplane for the first time, I was mentioning this to you offline a few weeks ago. We flew to a place called Amanwana, and on the way there, it's in Indonesia. It's an island actually off the coast of Bali.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this massive, beautiful volcano that has a natural lake in the top of it. And the flight flew over that volcano. So the flight itself was an experience. It was part of the resort experience. It was part of the island experience. And when we landed, because there was a pier that jutted out into the ocean, and they landed the plane in the water right in front of that pier, right? And we stopped there. The whole resort came because it was just so much fun. So it wasn't just an experience for the people that were flying. It was an experience for the people at the resort too. And it happened like once or twice a day. And I was there for a few days, and every day people would gather and watch the plane come in and land, and then greet all the guests. So for the resort, it was a massive thing. And I think people forget, like, you're right. It's not just about the mobility and the transportation. It's about this incredible experience that I still to today will never forget. Is that fair?
Right. Absolutely. So I think it's exactly that. Yeah, we call it, our official tagline is once in a lifetime, every time. Right. And so it's this really once in a lifetime experience, but actually it is something that you can repeat, because it is not a private jet, right? So it's not as let's say limited in reach for just a kind of ultra luxury or VIP segment. It is really something that many, of course, it's a premium service. It's not a mass market product, and it cannot be just based on the underlying economics of ensuring that we need to run it as a business. It's hard to price this very cheaply, but it's not an inaccessible premium service, right?
Right. No, it's very accessible.
The other thing on top of that, and so this is really kind of I would call it the sexy part of the business, right? The one we can market, the one, you see the poster behind me here we go.
I like
right?
it. I like it.
Like I mean, it's beautiful. It's amazing. Like you talked about that experience of even just the arrival experience.
Yes.
Right. And people seeing that and seeing other people arrive, just that alone.
Cheering. I'm
that's the sexy part.
Definitely cheering. Yeah, go ahead.
But then, and sort of linking it even back a little bit to what I was talking about earlier, when you asked me about also my previous experience, there's a whole host of other use cases that we're extremely excited about as well, where we see this increased accessibility all of a sudden means increased accessibility for other purposes, for purposes like medical evacuations, for purposes like delivering of crucial goods and possibly, logistics and freight services. It means, reaching hard or almost inaccessible places now within possibly minutes and hours, when, in some cases it could have taken days, to actually get to the place. So this is another component that to us is very important, and it's perhaps less sexy from a marketing perspective, from sort of putting it out there.
Sexy, but yeah, go ahead.
I suppose you're right. You're right. Yeah. So, but a very important one, right? And that goes back again to this question of how does it actually enable, I think in some way also improvement of potentially the economy, or improvement of, very important services out there. The same way goes for the environment. And I mean, I can go on, and you need to stop me here, right? But, where we say aviation is not perhaps, or building an airline is not perhaps the most sustainable kind of business. And what we want to make sure is that to the extent possible, we don't exacerbate the problem.
Right.
This is a bit easier said than done, and it takes a little bit of time. But what we can do is build it into the core of our philosophy and business to ensure that we do the things as soon as commercially and technically feasible. So what does this mean? Just one example is full electric retrofitting of the aircraft. So to say, okay, once it is feasible, and right now, unfortunately, the battery technology is not quite at the level where it can have the reach that we need, right? So you might get up to maybe half an hour flight time on a purely electric aircraft.
Right.
That's just not long enough.
No, it's not far enough. It's not, even though you can land in the water, that's not enough time.
Not quite. I mean, that can get us from Bangkok to Pattaya. That's something, but we do need a little bit more than that, right? And so, so we're estimating, let's say, really optimistically thought maybe 5 years, but probably more towards like an 8-year time window, where we say within that time frame, if we can be the first to have a full electric fleet in Southeast Asia, we're all in, right? We're all committed to that. And so that again is a bit this view on much wider than just building a. It's amazing to talk about the experience and to talk about a great image out there, but I think holistically it's important to look at that and say, okay, how can we do our little part? We're not a huge airline, but our little part to make sure that we're doing something good.
And this gets back to what I was talking about before at the beginning, and maybe this is a good way to end. You've seamlessly moved back and forth between this social innovation and impact investing into traditional businesses. And there's a secular change taking place in the world right now to try to make those businesses more sustainable. I didn't ask you about it, but you mentioned it. And I think that's a real thing. And I think if you look at one of the other things that in which you're involved, I think you are, which is Catapult, which is one of the most best known tech impact investors in Europe. And you look at all the experience that you have there and what's getting built there, to be able to sort of connect that with what you're already building in the airline, I think is going to make watching the build out of Siam Seaplane really interesting going forward. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I feel like we could go on. Maybe we'll have you come back as this business continues to develop. But I want to thank you, Dennis Keller, the Chief Business Officer at Siam Seaplane, for coming on and doing this today. This was really awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michael. Really appreciate it. Been a pleasure.
TDPK Podcasts, Thailand GameChanger, inside the minds of Thailand's innovators.